On the morning of December 7, 1941, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida climbed into the lead aircraft of the first wave against Pearl Harbor, and, once his pilots confirmed complete surprise, radioed back the coded phrase that would echo through history for the rest of the century: Tora, Tora, Tora. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft followed him that morning, flown by pilots who had trained for months in secrecy for a single devastating strike. What almost none of them knew, in that moment of overwhelming tactical success, was how differently the war would treat each of them individually over the 4 years that followed. Some would not survive the year. Others would live through nearly every major battle of the Pacific War and walk away largely unscathed. And at least one of the men who helped plan the attack that brought America into the war would, decades later, spend his life traveling the world preaching Christian forgiveness, including in the United States itself. This is the story of what actually happened to the pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor, and how unevenly the war that followed treated the men who started it. The secrecy surrounding the mission's preparation was itself extraordinary by the standards of any military operation, with the entire strike force training for months at remote Japanese naval bases specifically chosen for their isolation, practicing the demanding shallow water torpedo attack technique repeatedly against simulated harbor conditions before any pilot involved was told the actual target of the operation they were rehearsing for. This level of compartmentalized secrecy meant that even many of the pilots who ultimately flew the mission did not know they were training specifically to attack Pearl Harbor until relatively close to the actual date of the strike itself, a security precaution that succeeded completely in preserving the element of surprise that made the attack's tactical success possible in the first place. The Pearl Harbor strike force launched from 6 Japanese aircraft carriers on the morning of December 7th, carrying fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers in 2 coordinated waves, commanded overall by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, but planned in its tactical details primarily by Commander Minoru Genda, a brilliant and unconventional staff officer widely regarded within the Japanese Navy as one of its most capable aviation strategists. Genda had spent months developing the specific tactics needed to launch a successful shallow-water torpedo attack against battleships moored in Pearl Harbor's relatively confined harbor, a technical problem that had required specially modified torpedoes with wooden fins to prevent them from diving too deep in the harbor's shallow water before leveling out toward their targets. Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot chosen to lead the attack's first wave, was a veteran aviator with extensive prior combat experience over China, and his selection reflected both his flying skill and his ability to coordinate a large, complex strike force across multiple aircraft types, converging on a single target from different directions and altitudes. The attack proceeded almost exactly as planned, achieving complete tactical surprise and inflicting catastrophic damage on the American battleship fleet moored along what came to be known as Battleship Row, while Japanese losses that day were remarkably light given the scale of destruction inflicted. A small number of aircraft shot down against a battle fleet largely destroyed or badly damaged in a matter of hours. The training that produced this cohort of pilots reflected years of careful, deliberate investment by the pre-war Japanese Navy in a small number of exceptionally skilled aviators, a system that valued depth of individual pilot skill over the ability to rapidly train large numbers of replacements. Many of the pilots who flew against Pearl Harbor had accumulated hundreds or, in some cases, well over 1,000 flight hours before the attack, a level of experience that made them formidable opponents in the war's opening months, but that also meant Japan possessed no comparable pipeline for replacing this specific cohort quickly if losses began to mount. For the pilots who survived the Pearl Harbor mission, the following months brought an almost unbroken string of Japanese victories across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, and many of the same aviators who had flown against Pearl Harbor continued flying combat missions in support of Japan's rapid advance through the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean in the early months of 1942. This continuity meant that the same relatively small, highly experienced pool of carrier aviators who had trained for years before the war and executed the Pearl Harbor attack successfully continued to be the backbone of Japanese naval air power through the war's first 6 months, a period during which their skill and experience gave Japan a real and measurable advantage over the less experienced Allied pilots they faced. That continuity ended abruptly at the Battle of Midway, in June of 1942, an engagement that inflicted catastrophic losses on precisely this veteran corps of Japanese naval aviation. Many pilots who had flown against Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were killed at Midway, either shot down during the battle itself or lost when their carriers were sunk beneath them. A single battle that permanently altered the demographic composition of Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. The pilots who had been the most experienced, most capable aviators in the Japanese Navy at the start of the war were disproportionately represented among the losses at Midway, since it was precisely these veteran squadrons that had been assigned to Nagumo's carrier strike force for the operation. Beyond Midway, the same generation of Pearl Harbor veterans who had survived that battle continued to face elevated risk through the brutal, extended air campaigns fought over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands during the second half of 1942, engagements that, while individually smaller in scale than Midway, collectively ground down Japan's remaining pool of experienced carrier and land-based naval aviators at a steady, relentless pace over many months of continuous combat. Pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor and even Midway found themselves flying repeated combat missions against an increasingly well-equipped and tactically sophisticated American opponent, odds that grew steadily less favorable for Japanese aircrew as the war progressed into 1943 and beyond. Mitsuo Fuchida himself narrowly avoided the fate of many of his Pearl Harbor squadron mates at Midway through circumstances that had nothing to do with combat skill. He was aboard the carrier Akagi during the battle, grounded from flying duty by a recent appendectomy, watching from the ship's deck rather than from the cockpit of an aircraft when American dive bombers struck the carrier in the 6-minute attack that would later become one of the most studied engagements of the entire war. Fuchida was injured when the Akagi was hit, suffering broken bones in the ensuing chaos of evacuating the burning carrier. But he survived, one of a shrinking number of Pearl Harbor veterans who lived through the battle that killed so many of his former squadron mates. Minoru Genda, the chief planner behind the Pearl Harbor attack, similarly survived the war's full duration, continuing to serve in senior planning and staff roles for the Japanese Navy through the war's final years, a position that kept him largely away from the direct combat exposure that claimed so many of the pilots who had actually flown the Pearl Harbor mission itself. Genda's survival, like Fuchida's, reflected less about luck in combat specifically and more about the different risk profiles faced by staff planners, compared to the aviators actually flying repeated combat missions over the following years of an increasingly desperate war. For the ordinary pilots who had flown as part of the large strike force against Pearl Harbor, without holding senior command or planning roles, survival through the entire war proved considerably less common. Naval historians examining the fate of Pearl Harbor's aircrew have found that a substantial proportion did not survive to see Japan's surrender in 1945, killed across the many subsequent battles of the Pacific War, at Midway, in the grinding air battles over the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, and in the increasingly desperate final years of the war as American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands themselves. The same broader pattern documented elsewhere in Japanese naval aviation. Elite, highly trained pilots ground down through years of attrition with no adequate system to replace their experience, applied with particular force to the specific cohort of aviators who had flown the war's opening strike. Fuchida's own path through the remainder of the war after Midway continued to differ from that of the ordinary combat pilots who had flown alongside him at Pearl Harbor. His injuries from the Akagi's sinking kept him away from active flight duty for an extended recovery period, and he subsequently moved into staff and training roles for the remainder of the war rather than returning to frontline combat aviation, a transition that, again largely as a result of circumstances outside his direct control, further improved his odds of surviving to see the war's end compared to pilots who continued flying combat missions in the war's increasingly desperate final years. Mitsuo Fuchida's post-war life took a direction that surprised many who had known him only as the aviator, whose radio message had announced Pearl Harbor's success to the Japanese fleet. In the years following Japan's defeat, Fuchida underwent a religious conversion to Christianity, a transformation he attributed in his own later writings to a combination of encounters with American missionaries and a personal reckoning with the war's devastation, including his direct knowledge of the destruction inflicted at Hiroshima, a city he had been scheduled to survey shortly after the atomic bombing, and where he witnessed the aftermath firsthand. Fuchida spent much of the remainder of his life traveling internationally as a Christian evangelist, including extensive speaking tours within the United States itself, where he described his own role in the Pearl Harbor attack candidly to American audiences, while presenting his subsequent religious conversion as a personal path toward reconciliation with a former enemy. This trajectory, from the pilot whose radio call announced one of the most consequential surprise attacks in military history, to a Christian evangelist speaking openly to American congregations about his wartime past, represents one of the more genuinely unusual post-war paths taken by any senior Axis military figure of the Second World War, and it has drawn sustained interest from historians and religious scholars alike, studying how individuals who played direct roles in major wartime events processed and publicly discussed that history in the decades that followed. Fuchida's own written and spoken accounts of Pearl Harbor, produced across the post-war decades, remain among the most detailed and frequently cited first-hand descriptions of the attack from the Japanese side, valuable specifically because he was both a direct participant and, in his later decades, someone willing to discuss that participation openly and at length with American audiences and historians. Genda's post-war path took a considerably different direction, reflecting his background as a military planner and strategist, rather than a combat aviator. He went on to serve in Japan's post-war Air Self-Defense Force, established after the war under new constitutional arrangements that permitted Japan a limited self-defense military capability, eventually rising to a senior general officer rank within that organization. Genda later entered Japanese politics, serving in the country's national legislature for multiple terms, a post-war career trajectory that placed him among the relatively small number of senior imperial Japanese military figures who transitioned successfully into prominent public roles within post-war Japanese democratic institutions, a path made possible in part by his role as a planner rather than a figure as publicly and personally associated with the attack's executions. Fuchida's conversion narrative, as he presented it in his own later writings and speaking engagements, centered heavily on a chance encounter with a released American prisoner of war, whose account of forgiveness and Christian faith, delivered years after the war's end, reportedly affected Fuchida deeply enough to prompt his own subsequent religious study and eventual conversion. Whatever the precise sequence of personal events that led to his transformation, the public record of his post-war decades shows a man who spoke extensively, and, by most accounts, genuinely, about reconciliation, addressing American church audiences directly about his role in the attack that had brought the United States into the war, a level of direct engagement with former enemies that few other senior Japanese military figures of his generation undertook so publicly or for so many years. The broader story of Pearl Harbor's aircrew, considered collectively rather than through the two most prominent individual figures, reflects the same pattern of uneven survival that characterized Japanese naval aviation across the entire war. Post-war Japanese veterans associations and historians conducting oral history projects in the decades following the war worked to document the individual fates of as many Pearl Harbor participants as could be traced. An effort complicated by incomplete wartime records, the deaths of many participants in subsequent battles before any systematic documentation effort could reach them, and the natural passage of time as the surviving cohort of Pearl Harbor veterans grew older and smaller with each passing decade after the war's end. What these efforts have established, in broad outline, is a workforce whose survival prospects diverged sharply, based largely on factors that had little to do with the individual skill or bravery any given pilot had shown during the Pearl Harbor mission itself. Officers and pilots who moved into staff, training, or planning roles after Pearl Harbor, whether through promotion, injury, or simple reassignment, tended to survive the war at meaningfully higher rates than those who continued flying frontline combat missions across the following years of steadily escalating and increasingly desperate fighting. This divergence mirrors, in miniature, the broader story of Japanese naval aviation's collapse across the war as a whole, a force that entered the war with an extraordinarily skilled and experienced pilot corps and exited it having lost the overwhelming majority of those same men to nearly 4 years of continuous, grinding combat attrition. Shigekazu Shimazaki, who led the second wave of the Pearl Harbor attack, focused primarily on horizontal bombing against the battleships already struck by the first wave's torpedo attacks, represents a further variation on this pattern of divergent post-war fates. Shimazaki survived the Pearl Harbor mission and continued flying combat operations through the following years of the war, a career trajectory that placed him among the more experienced surviving strike leaders from the original attack. Though detailed post-war biographical information about many of the second wave's individual pilots remains considerably less thoroughly documented in English-language historical sources than the more prominent stories of Fuchida and Genda specifically, a reflection of how uneven the post-war historical record became once the war's immediate aftermath gave way to the broader project of reconstructing Japan's post-war society and institutions. There is a broader historiographical point worth making about why the individual fates of Pearl Harbor's aircrew took so long to be systematically documented at all. In the immediate post-war period, American and Japanese historical attention focused overwhelmingly on the attack itself, its planning, its tactical execution, and its consequences for starting the Pacific War, rather than on tracing what happened afterward to the hundreds of individual pilots who had flown it. It was only as the post-war decades passed, and as oral history projects on both sides of the Pacific began systematically interviewing aging veterans before that generation was lost entirely, that historians began piecing together a fuller picture of how unevenly the war had actually treated the men who had flown together on a single, coordinated morning in December of 1941. Mitsuo Fuchida died in 1976, having spent the final decades of his life as a religious figure rather than a military one. His post-war identity so thoroughly reshaped by his conversion and subsequent ministry that many Americans who encountered him in his later speaking tours knew him primarily as a Christian evangelist, with an extraordinary personal history rather than exclusively as the pilot who had announced Pearl Harbor's success to the Japanese fleet decades earlier. Minoru Genda died in 1989, having completed a post-war career that took him from wartime naval staff planner to a senior officer in Japan's post-war self-defense forces, and finally into elected national politics, a trajectory reflecting the particular, somewhat paradoxical position occupied by senior Japanese military planners in the construction of post-war Japan's new, constitutionally limited defense institutions. The broader story of Pearl Harbor's aircrew, taken as a whole, resists easy summary, specifically because it was never a single, uniform experience. Some men who flew that morning died within the year at Midway. Others survived nearly the entire war, only to be lost in its final desperate months. A small number, including two of the mission's most prominent figures, lived long, full post-war lives that took them in directions few observers watching the attack unfold on December 7th could have predicted. What ties these divergent individual stories together is simply that all of them began, for better or worse, in the same coordinated strike force on the same morning. A single mission, whose consequences for the individual men who flew it played out across 4 decades, and in some cases, entire additional careers and callings that had nothing to do with the war that had first brought them together. If you want to understand how differently the war treated the men who flew one of history's most consequential surprise attacks, from catastrophic losses at Midway to a post-war life spent preaching reconciliation on American soil, this is the story worth knowing in full. Subscribe to Pacific War Tales for more long-form World War II history from the Pacific Theater, told with the names, the dates, and the details intact.